Animal Well was a game I was very excited to pick up back in May of 2024. It had all the right boxes ticked for me. It was indie, it had puzzles, it was a metroidvania, it had a de-emphasis on combat, and it had rave reviews both on Steam and on pretty much every major gaming media outlet. The game has a very basic premise. You're a little bean character in an open-ended 2D world full of spooky animals, and you jump around solving puzzles with the goal of reaching nondescript objectives on the edges of the map. But a simple idea done with excellence can be extremely satisfying, so this was another point of appeal for me. But upon playing Animal Well, and after a brief honeymoon period, I realised that I didn't really like it. And what's more, I didn't even think it was very good. In fact, I think that there are some fundamental problems in Animal Well, and that those reviews I mentioned were somewhat exaggerated. So in this video, I want to talk about some of those core issues which I think disqualify Animal Well from the Indie Hall of Fame, into which reviewers were so quick to inaugurate it. I'm also going to talk about some of the reasons I think it got that treatment despite everything. So without further ado, let's talk about the core of any puzzle game. Animal Well's primary identity is that of a puzzle game. There's platforming, there's metroidvania-ing, but puzzles are the central meat. Puzzles are the core gameplay loop, and rule of thumb is that if your core gameplay loop is well designed, you're going to have a very satisfying game, even if the presentation, story and so on are underwhelming. Look no farther than Sudoku for proof of that. However, if your primary loop is poorly designed, you can have all the bells, whistles and CRT lines in the world, and your game will still be lackluster. Obviously, I think that Animal Well fits the latter description, and I'm going to illustrate that with an example in just a moment. But generally, the puzzles are easy, uninteresting, sometimes even annoying, and on top of everything, they're not fun to execute. They don't even really leverage the theme of the game: animals. This was particularly disappointing for me because the concept of integrating realistic, non-anthropomorphized animals into a game world like this one was a central part of the whole appeal. It's not like animals aren't present, but they're mechanically shallow. Hedgehogs walk around platforms and hurt you if you touch them. Chinchillas walk towards you and you can jump on their heads. Crows peck you if you annoy them. Apart from some rare set pieces, many of which also fall flat, the animals are one-dimensional and lack the dynamism of the animals in something like Rain World.
Oh, don't fight over my corpse!
Or even the enemies in Hollow Knight, a comparison I'll return to later. For now, just know that the animals are secondary to the real star of the show: buttons. For much of this game, you're not playing Animal Well at all, you're playing Button Well. It's like a haberdasher's workshop in here. Most puzzles simply involve pressing buttons in order to open doors, sometimes with the assistance of animals. In most cases, not much thought is even required, to the point where the label of puzzle becomes slightly questionable. And that really isn't just me being facetious. Take a look at a typical puzzle, or rather obstacle, in Animal Well. I enter a room and immediately see a door with an icon above it specifying that a certain number of buttons must be pressed in order for it to open. I then see the buttons. It is then immediately apparent what I must do in order to press those buttons, open the door, and proceed. I execute that solution and I move on. In terms of a puzzle, this really isn't any more difficult or involved than Minecraft parkour.
Alright, let's get this over with.
Let's go! Hurry up and do the parkour, noob.
Down here in Parkour Prison, even the cells have 1-block jumps. If you miss
Or indeed than entering the toilet code at Cafe Nero's, which is why I have difficulty thinking of these things as puzzles. There's certainly an illusion of a puzzle, but when you look at it, what is actually challenging you? That's why, instead of calling these puzzles, I think of them more as procedures. They kind of remind me of the somewhat derisive indie puzzle platformer label that was slapped on games like Braid and 1,000 less influential titles back in the 2010s. The implication that label carried was that these games were unchallenging and somewhat mechanically uninventive, but with a bit of indie sheen to them. If you remember those games, or at least you remember forgetting about them, you'll probably find Animal Well somewhat nostalgic. Contrast this all with what I think is a very good puzzle game, Baba Is You. In Baba Is You, you move around little blocks which define the rules by which the level operates. A core concept infinitely stronger than anything mechanical Animal Well has to offer. Using this system, Baba Is You presents the player with constant new challenges, novelty in the form of new rules to discover, an amazing sense of self-consistency, and most of all, fun, in the form of the wacky things that you can get up to in pursuit of clearing levels. Maybe you're creating infinite Babas, or you're shifting around the level itself, or you're racing from a flood of lava towards the goal. That game's dev, RV Teikari, told Gamasutra that he designed these puzzles from the basis of a cool or amusing interaction between the rules, and then worked backwards to form the puzzle around that. And it shows. I don't think that Animal Well's dev, Billy Basso, had the same approach. In comparison to its many fantastic peers in the puzzle game genre, all with excitement, challenge, and just interesting things to look at, Animal Well is just a day at the button pressing factory. So I've done a decent bit of complaining about the puzzles of Animal Well, but this game also promises to be a metroidvania, a promise which only adds to the confusion. I really think that it is this aspect of the game that takes it from being a decent idea implemented poorly to being a poor idea implemented poorly. That idea being a puzzle Metroidvania. Now, I don't really like the term Metroidvania because I always feel like I have to explain it, even to people who are into games. A better name might be Toy Collector, although I guess that the Skylanders rabbit hole has got that particular term on lock, so maybe you could call them Ability Explorers or something like that. Anyway, the central idea that I'm considering here is this loop of exploring the world to collect character abilities, which then unlock new ways to progress. Typically, a lot of backtracking is involved as you unlock new ways to interact with old areas. It's a format for the secondary and tertiary gameplay loops of exploration and unlocking abilities, respectively, which encapsulate the primary loop, whatever that is. The outer loops feed back into the primary loop as the expansion of the player's freedoms let them interact with the primary gameplay mechanics in new ways. For Animal Well, that primary loop is the puzzling, but action Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight and many other titles are far more common. I do actually have a few qualms with even calling Animal Well a Metroidvania, but it's referred to as such by the media, it has the tag on Steam, and the dev refers to it as a sort of Metroidvania, so I'll stick with it. So this is a puzzle Metroidvania. As discussed, part of the core definition of the Metroidvania sort of genre is how the abilities you collect let you interact with the world in new ways. So what do the abilities in Animal Well do? What is there in this world to interact with? How do the abilities interact with the primary gameplay loop? Oh, these abilities. They all press buttons. And what else could they do? The primary gameplay is all about buttons and mediocre puzzles. There's a little bit of platforming, which I'll touch on in a moment, but suffice it to say, it's more of a necessity of the fact that this is a 2D game rather than a core mechanic. So since 99% of the gameplay is about pressing buttons, of course that's the only possible thing the Metroidvania toolset can actually facilitate. Take an admittedly unflattering example, the slink. The slink is an item which falls like a slinky, which is cute, and it presses buttons. There are some unique challenges with the slink where one must understand the precise mechanics of how it falls in order to press the right button, but in most cases it's used as little more than a timer as it falls down a set of stairs and presses buttons in a specific order and timing. There's nothing challenging about this. Again, it's not a puzzle, it's just a procedure. In any other game, this slink wouldn't even be a collectible character ability. It would just be in the room or abstracted into a start button and a timer. It's like if in Portal you unlocked a tilt trolley which let you pick up the cubes. People would rightly ask why it was being presented like that and not as the E key. But in the context of this being a Metroidvania, the slink does have to be a collectible ability, because it acts as a check before you can solve certain puzzles and move into new parts of the map. During a conversation about this, I was reminded of a video by Yahtzee Croshaw, in which he complains that the puzzles in the newest Monkey Island game are little more than a series of locks and keys. They rarely rely on creative solutions and more frequently on finding specific inventory items which can be click-dragged over certain problems to progress.
Whoops.
And due to the severe easiness of Animal Well's puzzles, one can quite easily categorize most of them in a similar manner, with each ability being used most often as nothing but a key to a lock to a new part of the world. As a slightly more flattering example of one of the items, take the yo-yo. The yo-yo smashes spikes, moves animals for some reason, and yes, it does press buttons. Smashing spikes is by far the most interesting function, because it opens up unforeseen exploration options, a common appeal of Metroidvanias that is preciously rare in Animal Well. But when it comes to puzzles, the yo-yo provides no value at all. It kind of curves around walls in a funny way, but this is never used to challenge the player. Instead, what will happen is you'll see a bent alcove in a wall with a button at the end, and you'll send the yo-yo down to press that button. And that is literally how locks and keys work. So why is this a fundamental problem? Every other Metroidvania can get away with very simple mechanics like double jumping that are essentially keys to various platforming locks. So why can't Animal Well get away with its slinks and yo-yos? To me, the main difference is the tempo of the gameplay and the nature of the primary loop. Hollow Knight, and most other action ability explorers, has combat and challenging platforming. These provide a kind of busybody moment-to-moment gameplay in which the player can express their skill and play with their new tools. Not only does an extra jump expand your horizons of exploration, it lets you evade attacks and attack enemies in a new way, and it obviously expands your freedoms in the very challenging traversal sections. Animal Well's primary gameplay loop lacks the scope for skill expression. There's nothing other than puzzles and running to and fro from puzzles. But puzzles don't give the player the freedom to play with their toys, because in any halfway functional puzzle game, and that is an honour I would extend to Animal Well, the puzzles are only going to have one or two solutions maximum, and therefore only one or two ways to use your abilities. that's it. That's the solution. As mentioned before, Animal Well does also style itself as a platformer, but only 3 items out of a total 10 remotely influence how you move, and only one of those can really be used at will to influence your mobility in a meaningful way. This is compared to Hollow Knight's 4 out of 8 abilities, not including the 3 combat-oriented spells, which obviously engage with the combat loop. That one at-will mobility item I actually thought was quite impressive when I first found it. It's a wand that lets you create bubbles to act as floating platforms, which is an interesting twist on the classic double jump. It's also the only item that requires skill expression to use. But turns out you can use the wand to jump infinitely, thereby invalidating the majority of platforming in the game. And this is the first item you're likely to find, as quickly as 20 minutes in. Needless to say, I find the mobility and platforming side of things to be a little under-thought out. Anyway, I'm obviously not going to suggest that Animal Well should have combat specifically. As mentioned earlier, the lack of combat was actually a big part of the appeal to me. But I do think that a game in a subgenre predicated on collecting abilities that modify a primary loop really needs a carefully chosen primary loop that has the scope to interact with those abilities. And this is especially the case when the game has no story and little difficulty, variety, or novelty to keep me going otherwise. It's a shame that Basso didn't lean into his earlier idea to make a survival horror type game, as then the tools could have integrated nicely into skill-demanding survival gameplay, which could in turn have brought the animals of Animal Well back into focus. With all this complaining about puzzles, real animal heads might be chomping at the bit to mention Layer 3. The layers thing is something Basso used to describe how the game is organized on a meta level.
The base layer is something the average person can play through and enjoy to completion.
But then there's a second layer, which for most games you would consider this part like 100%ing the game. The third layer has puzzles that don't really present themselves as puzzles. They might go unnoticed for years potentially, or they might require some community collaboration to solve.
I do agree that Layer 3 is where the game really has a unique selling point, shared only by select few other titles like Fez. Layer 3 actually holds a lot of content and can be very entertaining if you're an ARG psychopath. You've probably heard of ARGs. The term stands for Alternate Reality Game, and what it means is a kind of online-offline treasure hunt. A famous example is the one that Valve used to tease Portal 2, which involved decoding in-game signals to find phone numbers and passwords that gave access to information about the new game. Clearly, Animal Well isn't an ARG, it's just a G. But I bring up ARGs because the Layer 3 puzzles involve the same sort of obscure pattern finding and far-reaching logic that ARGs typically employ, and clearly they appeal to the same sort of people. In fact, Animal Well did have a pre-release ARG, which apparently attracted enough gifted individuals that the dev had to dissuade them from ARG pareidolia in a dev blog titled ARG Guardrails. Now, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with enjoying ARGs. It probably has a comorbidity with enjoying animal cruelty, but the thing is, much like animal cruelty, I don't think most people do like solving ARGs. I think they just like watching it done on YouTube. That's why when an ARG is being solved, the people actually solving it are typically a small contingent of Discord denizens, but videos about ARGs can rack up millions of views. The Layer 3 puzzles are no doubt creative. The coolest of these involves collecting all the secret eggs from Layer 2, using them to find a code, and then using that to access a computer. If you have a printer connected, the game will print off pages which you can fold into origami and find another secret code.
One moment. My house is not haunted. The printer was still plugged in, sitting on the wall, and every time I hit that computer in game, it printed this shit.
If you don't have a printer, you can instead scan this grass as a barcode to get the same code. I do see the creativity here, and I really appreciate it. But this is a puzzle that will be enjoyed by 0.01% of people playing this game. And for the common player, I don't think it significantly adds to the value. As the devlog states in the guardrails post, just to be clear though, Animal Well isn't a collection of lots of difficult puzzles. There are some complicated puzzles in addition to the main gameplay mechanics. I take that to mean that Layer 3 isn't meant to be the main game, and so even if Layer 3 has some value to it, it doesn't redeem Animal Well in my eyes. In that same post, there's another interesting quote. We started to notice that a few dedicated people were imagining clues where none existed. They checked out work that Billy had done years before Animal Well, in the hopes he might have buried a clue back then. They checked his GitHub page. One person noticed that the file size of the test build on Steam increased by 7 kilobytes. The joys of the communal act of solving a puzzle together in real time are counterbalanced by a sense of FOMO in case the community discovers a puzzle without you. This really encapsulates the rest of my thoughts. For one thing, there's the illusion that there's a clever puzzle around every corner. But on the other side, even if you are an ARG person of interest and you love solving these sorts of puzzles, they are actually solved communally. And it's possible for the community to solve it without you. And the thing is, they have. Layer 3, like an ARG, was an event with a discrete time span, which is now over. Only a few weeks after release, the community found a secret which contained a voice message from the developer Basso saying that this was the most obscure secret in the game, and they were surprised that anyone had got this far.
If you're hearing this, that means you just solved a set of puzzles that I honestly did not really design to be solvable. I didn't even expect people to discover them, so...
You could go completely web silent on the game and solve it all yourself, but that would probably take years, and it wouldn't be in the community spirit that these puzzles were clearly designed with. In fact, one puzzle even requires you to communicate with other players in order to solve it, so it is literally impossible to solve this game on your own. So there you go. To enjoy the endgame of Animal Well, you have to like solving ARGs, and you have to actually like solving them, not just watching videos about how other people solved them on YouTube. Even if a game makes good YouTube content, I don't think that reflects in the actual quality of the game. And even if you really do genuinely enjoy solving ARGs, you also have to have liked solving them about 4 months ago when Layer 3 was already being completed. So why is this game getting rave reviews? A lot of major outlets and YouTubers that I respect have written slightly embarrassing hagiographies about this game.
Animal Well is a brilliant game. In fact, I dare say this is one of the best metroidvanias I've ever played. But the true genius here is in the masterful level and puzzle design. All this is to say that Animal Well really respects the player's intelligence, making every new find invite experimentation and every triumph over its challenges oh so sweet.
I was never stumped for long by any of Animal Well's conundrums, yet the solutions were nearly always creative enough that I constantly felt satisfied whenever I solved one. Animal Well might look antiquated and familiar at first glance, but this well is cavernous and unpredictable.
It's hard writing a review for a game that's really, really special because you struggle to convey just how special and how amazing it is. You know, it's this very sensational thing. You're navigating and solving these puzzles using super basic tools. Movement, jumping, the process of pressing buttons to open doors, and yet even there, even there, I consistently found myself shaking my head in bewilderment, audibly gasping to myself. It's a degree of cleverness that has honestly floored me. I had the incredible privilege of playing the game before release. Massive thanks to Big Mode for that, by the way.
Animal Well confidently stands as one of the best games I've played in years, full stop. There are so many puzzles that reward careful observation of the sights and sounds of the world around you, and the joy of figuring out a connection between two seemingly disparate parts of the world is palpable. Animal Well is a special game that I cannot recommend enough.
This is the new indie game from visionary artist Billy Basso. It was a passion project made over 7 years solely by Billy Basso.
But did you know that it took 12 years to make? Nothing has ever taken 12 years to make.
He truly made the entire game from scratch by himself. He literally made the game physics engine first and then created the game inside that engine. This is like God not only making the world, he had to make the universe to put that thing in.
This isn't even a hagiography, it's just fucking Genesis.
It truly is a marvel how Billy fit so much joy into something only as big as about 4 MP3 files of Darude Sandstorm.
You can double-click it in Steam and be loaded into your save, playing in just a couple seconds. Yeah, it's speedy. But also, the entire thing fits inside of 34 megabytes of space. I mean, this simple 7-second clip of cranes right here is bigger than that. It's insane. That might make you think that the game is short, but no. The developer is just a magical wizard genius.
I think I've talked about why I disagree with most of these statements, but one that stood out to me was this choice cut from IGN's review.
What's so brilliant about Animal Well is that despite the lack of context or tutorials, it does a good job rewarding the experimentation it encourages. Very early on, this freaky ghost thing will block your progress. What can you do? Not much, until you meander down another path and find some firecrackers growing out of the ground. Put 2 and 2 together, and a flurry of colorful sparks and a lot of loud noise later, the ghost is gone. All of Animal Well is like this.
So you get items which solve problems. It kind of feels like the absolute fundamentals of video games are being praised so highly just for their inclusion in this game. And this wasn't even the first time that I've heard this point of praise. Austin from SkillUp had mentioned almost exactly the same thing.
Animal Well endeavors to make every new tool serve many functions, expanding your capabilities exponentially. The only example I'll divulge for you here is one of the first items you pick up called a firecracker. Really had no idea what these were for, but at one point I encountered this ghost thing and I panicked and chucked the firecracker and it ended up scaring it away. But then later on I found myself in a room blanketed in darkness. Couldn't see where I was going and I thought, I wonder what happens when I throw one here. And sure enough, it lit up the entire room, allowing me to more easily get to where I needed to go.
It's kind of like a point of motivated reasoning, where this game is good, so anything that goes into it must automatically be clever as well. Certainly part of the equation for this game's scores is the presentation. The visuals are great, especially the larger animals and the level art, and the CRT style is nice enough. Although there isn't any music apart from the main theme, the sound design is very, very good. It's probably one of the highlights of the whole thing. There's no story, but I think there's just enough cryptic symbolism and seeming pretense of lore, intended or not, that pushes the experience from blank to understated, in a certain sort of light anyway. For better or worse, this has all the hallmarks of a critical indie darling. But take a look at the comments under any review, and I think another factor in this game's success is fairly clear. The involvement of Video Game Donkey. Any comments section related to Animal Well is just full of very funny Video Game Donkey in-jokes. Now, Video Game Donkey, one of the most popular gaming YouTubers on the platform, doesn't actually have anything to do with the development of this game. All of that was done by Basso, who started work on it in 2017.
It took 12 years to make. It took a really long time to make. It took longer than it took them to make the Great Wall of China!
But Donkey does own Big Mode, which stepped in as publisher 5 years later in 2022. Apart from his inherent meme appeal, I think Donkey's involvement as a snarky, cynical YouTuber who sticks it to the big companies, in turn rubs off on Animal Well and gives it a sort of stick-it-to-the-man appeal to certain people, fans especially. It kind of reminds me of when The Outer Worlds came out, which was a kind of Fallout derivative published by Obsidian, who made Fallout New Vegas. It got rave reviews, which, in hindsight, I think people mostly agree were reactions to what Bethesda was doing to the Fallout series at the time.
It's as if large parts of the population are literally unable to mention The Outer Worlds without somehow making it about Bethesda. I mean, haven't you heard? Bethesda are officially obsolete now. The Outer Worlds should scare Bethesda.
I mean, the game probably isn't bad, but is it really up there with New Vegas itself? Baba Is You, Death Stranding, The Outer Wilds? Of course, this isn't a perfect comparison, because the praise lathered on Animal Well isn't a reaction to the mistreatment of a specific franchise, nor is Animal Well derivative of anything in particular, apart from maybe Braid and Fez. But I do think that the reviews of Animal Well are a bit of a reaction to the specific state of the games industry. Shillup especially kept mentioning Animal Well as the gold standard for video games in this era of big budget schlock and live service nonsense.
Hey, remember when Donkey came out a while back and he said he was going to open a publisher but only publish good video games, and heaps of people laughed at him? Well, who's laughing now? Because his label's debut game, Animal Well, solo developed by a guy named Billy Basso, has absolutely crushed it. Put another way, it's a masterpiece. Was that close enough? It was close enough.
All Donkey, not the developer, had to do was publish a good game. It was that simple. It's not an uncommon sentiment. The Guardian, who give this 100 out of 100, said as much in the first line of their review. PC Gamer mentions Big Mode as a reason for its success. Rock Paper Shotgun said that computers have always been Animal Wells, and that the game feels like a celebration of quasi-Jungian animal figures. Okay. Anyway, Animal Well certainly isn't a bad game. I couldn't call anything bad when it was clearly made with such strong artistic intent. But I believe that if you're in the games are art crowd, you should be able to discuss games as art. Art is subjective, but can have objective failings. And the more that you think about art, the more you might find yourself disagreeing with what otherwise appears to be a consensus. I want to make it clear that I don't begrudge anyone for liking Animal Well. But I do think that the criticism of this game from journalists has been very weak indeed, and coloured by factors external to the game itself. After laying down some hard-earned cash on a poor purchase, I wanted to make this video as a counterbalance to demonstrate some of the problems that I got burned by. Sometimes in the still budding world of video games, something accretes enough gamer credit that it becomes certified fresh. People know it's good, without having to think too much about it. But you should never do that, because then you end up with decent, okay games being lauded as...
This is one of the most cleverly designed games I have ever played, full stop.
And then that becomes the pyrite standard that people aim for, rather than actual gold. With regard to Animal Well's legacy, I don't see it being talked about too much, even just a few months after release. I actually went on holiday over the summer and sort of forgot that I was even making the video, just because the game didn't stick in my mind. I think that might be true even if you really enjoyed it. The thing is, Animal Well is really part of the legacy of games like Fez and Braid, rather than something that will spawn a diaspora of its own, apart from whatever Big Mode puts out next. That's fine, but it isn't special. It isn't
a piece of art that was everything as good as I could ever want it to be.
Animal Well is currently £20.99 on Steam, or €24.50 or $24.99 USD, depending on where you are. I certainly wouldn't recommend it for that price, but maybe for 5,500 Kazakhstani tenge you could get yourself a bargain. Anyway, thanks for watching the first and maybe only video on video malts for a while. I do have other things to talk about, but I'm writing a thesis at the moment, so time is a little sparse. This video was kind of more about me working out a workflow so that I can make more videos faster in the future, even though this one took a very long time. So when I can, I'd like to populate the channel with shorter, snappy content, like some recommendations of the more obscure games I enjoy, or weird free games that I sometimes stumble across. Until then, thanks for watching, please leave a like, and consider subscribing. It certainly will not clutter your feed. See you next time.